Beguiled by its crimson power, there are those who have foreseen the Order of Rot, a cycle of death and rebirth, physically represented by the potent Aeonian bloom and the pests that are born from it. There's almost nothing as powerful in the lands between as the corrosive and corrupting power of the Rot. Even the mightiest of the demigods fell victim to its power, and the most fearsome Empyrean of them all has dedicated his life to repelling its power. In our era, we find that this order is unwillingly championed by Malenia, who has spent her entire life trying to deny the goddess of Rot within her. Yet the inevitability of her fate becomes tragically clear as Malenia is pushed to the limit by conflict and she ultimately loses herself to the Scarlet Rot, while those who worship her do everything in their power to prepare for her ascension. Yet the root of the Scarlet Rot has a far more expansive history, making it clear that Malenia is only the latest vessel in a play for power by an exceptionally powerful and patient outer god. So grab your hazmat suits and join me as we dive right into the depths of the Scarlet Rot and Malenia, the goddess of Rot. I think that before we get into the video proper, it would be worthwhile to understand what the adherents of Scarlet Rot expect to achieve, as well as getting an understanding of the Rot itself. Gowry, an important figure in all of this, who we will return to later, says the following regarding the foreseen Order of Rot.
Since Malenia fought Radahn, and the great scarlet flower blossomed in Aeonia, I have dedicated myself to her, and to the resplendence of the Order of Rot, the cycle of decay and rebirth.
So the Scarlet Rot, to those who venerate it, is a vehicle for a cycle of decay and rebirth. Much like Nurgle from Warhammer, disease brings death, but from the carcass of the dead comes new life, and so the cycle continues. As you will see as we go through the video, a lot of the ideas associated with the Scarlet Rot, such as butterflies, fungus, and blooming flowers, are symbolic of these ideas of rebirth and decay. The death-bringing aspect of the Scarlet Rot is especially clear when we see the wasting properties of the Rot in-game. The Rot Pot item aptly describes the effects of this as it reads, "The Rot bubbles up from the swamp of Aeonia and eats away at life like a vicious plague. It is a plague that eats away at life and flesh." As we see from Malenia and Millicent, both infection vectors, they have lost their limbs, which have been consumed by the Scarlet Rot, and when we are ourselves infected with it, we are devoured until we die. We can also see how the infection can devour someone else's brain, corroding their organs from the inside out, until they are little more than a rabid beast. Such is the fate of both Radahn and Ezekiel, both of whom have their minds wasted by the rot that writhes within them. This is not a natural disease, it is an aspect of the cosmic being known as the outer god of Rot, and as such it cannot be easily cured or repelled as a regular plague. Gowry comments on the fact that the gods could not even stop it, for he says,
"The rotting sickness that afflicts Millicent has no cure. When the Erd Tree flourished, even the demigods could not stave off its effects, despite their nigh godhood."
The only things that appear to have had any forestalling effect on it is fire and Miquella's unalloyed gold. And even then, fire only seems to have limited utility, as unless the infected are completely burned away, they can still be animated by the living plague, as seen by the plague zombies who still animate even when they're on fire and most of their bodies have been rotted away. I think we can see how unnatural this infection is by looking at the fact it can affect essentially every form of life imaginable. Dragons, halig trees, and even crystallians, inhuman life forms that don't even have fleshy bodies, and yet they can still become riddled with the Scarlet Rot. In fact, it even appears as some that have been infected, crystallians that is, have come to the halig tree for whatever reason, as if they are being made to serve Malenia, the goddess of Rot, as if the Scarlet of Rot somehow controls even these unusual life forms. And then there is the other facet of the cycle of rot, the rebirth half, i.e. the rebirth that happens in the wake of all of this death. This aspect is fittingly represented by the various fungi and mushrooms we see in areas afflicted by the Scarlet Rot. Mushrooms themselves are forms of life that grow out of decay, and so we can see in truth what Gary purports. New life is springing from that which has been broken down by the Scarlet Rot. With the death that it brings, so does it bring new life. Even Mikla's revered Halig Tree was no match for the overwhelming influence of the Rot. With Malenia returned from her conflicts, she has brought the wasting sickness itself to the tree. In my Mikla lore video, I argued that the presence of an Erd Tree avatar at Aphale implies that the Halig Tree itself is a sapling offshoot of the Erd Tree, and I take this from the description of the staff of the avatar, the weapons wielded by the avatars, and it reads the following. The avatars, emerging in the wake of the Elden Ring shattering, were determined to protect the withering Erd Tree's offspring. Therefore, why else would this avatar be here, if not to defend the Halig Tree, leading us to conclude it is an offshoot of the Erd Tree. So the very fact that the Scarlet Rot has infested not only this avatar, but this offshoot of the Erd Tree itself, is a testament to the potent and devastating nature of the Scarlet Rot. The Rot has hollowed out the Halig Tree and taken over its carcass completely. The Scarlet Rot mushrooms are growing from its bark and boughs, and literal waterfalls of the Scarlet Rot itself flow through the hollowed out centre of the Halig Tree itself, showing how overrun and saturated the tree is with the Scarlet Rot. Indeed, by the time we get to the tree, it is barely a husk for the Scarlet Rot, a far cry from the idealised tree that we see represented in the symbolism of Mikla's people and warriors. Aside from fungi, there are other examples of life that appear to form in the Scarlet Rot's wake, such as the pests and the giant ants, the latter of which is implied to be connected to the Rot through the ant spur rapier, and this would explain why they infest the underground areas and the Halig Tree, as these are areas both connected to an infection of Scarlet Rot. And whether they are born from the Rot or just thrive in it is up for debate. The giant ants are not the only misproportioned and giant animals that we see surviving in areas with Scarlet Rot, and we will return to that when we get to Caelid shortly. But suffice it to say, whilst others die in the wake of the Scarlet Rot, clearly there are some life forms that benefit from the decay that it brings. Of course, the pests themselves are the most connected to the Rot, especially since they are referred to as the kindred of Rot, suggesting they are themselves actually creatures of the Rot rather than creatures that just survive in the Rot. Interestingly, however, these pests were not born of the Laker Rot, nor the outer god of Rot directly, but they seem to be connected to Malenia more specifically. As such, they are often referred to as the children of the goddess, such as in the Kindred of Rot's Ashes, and specifically the pest's glaive, which is where it is stated they come from the Aeonian swamp directly, and its description reads as follows. Glaive made from a hard, sharpened shell, wielded by the pests who emerged from the swamp of Aeonia. So while the Scarlet Rot is a vicious and cleansing form of death, new life springs eternal from the decaying remains of the old. One needs only look at the real world to see that this is a reality of life. In the corpse of any decaying animal, one will find new life incubating, like maggots, as well as it providing great sustenance for other larval insects. I would suggest that these pests are evocative of this type of carrion life, an insectoid form that flourishes in the decaying remains of other life, especially given their appearance, which to me is something between a cockroach, a silverfish, and a centipede. Yet these creatures are not completely mindless beasts, as we learn from the item description again of the pest glaives, which reads as follows. Though men might recognise the keen intellect of the pests, evidenced by this scare's uncanny design, it will never be understood by them. Indeed, we see them participating in behaviour only exhibited by sentient life, such as guarding Millicent, who they see as a holy vessel for the Scarlet Rot. They of course are wielding weapons that they have themselves constructed, and they worship, such as the worshipping we see of the holy relic of the Scorpion Stinger in the Grand Cloister, and at the cult site within Celia Crystal Cave. And in addition, we see them serving beside peacefully their allies, such as the warriors at the Halig Tree, showing that they do have some sort of semblance of consciousness, that they don't just mindlessly attack everyone around them. Regardless, I see them as the beings that are most at peace and most connected to the Scarlet Rot. We know from the description of the Pest Threads incantation that these pale pests crawl through the lands afflicted by Scarlet Rot. It does not affect their bodies, and in fact they thrive in it, whereas other life is completely devoured by it. They are intimately linked to the Scarlet Rot and Malenia, goddess of Rot herself. They are the true children of the Rot. One of the constant indicators of the Rot's presence that we see in-game is of course butterflies, i.e. we see them in the depths of the rotten Halig Tree, and of course in the Aeonian Swamp there are butterflies aplenty. The imagery here is once again pretty clear. Butterflies are symbolic for rebirth, again in keeping with what the Scarlet Rot represents, a cycle of transformative life. A piece of imagery that is bluntly hammered home with Malenia's transformation into a goddess of Rot, when she emerges from a cocoon as a butterfly-esque being with butterfly wings made of butterflies. So that being said, yes, it looks like the Aeonian butterflies seem to be part of Malenia herself, for their description reads, "According to myth, these butterflies were once the wings of the goddess of Rot herself." And indeed, as mentioned, when Malenia does transform into the goddess of Rot, her wings do appear to be made of lots of these butterflies pressed together. Now, you'll realise that this poses a difficult lore quandary, and one that I will seek to explain in the course of this video. The problem is that most people assume that in her fight with us, this is the only time she has transformed into the goddess of Rot. Yet this would not make sense, because given these butterflies exist already before we force Malenia to transform, it means she must have already transformed before, so that these butterflies could break off and infest the lands between. I would therefore suggest that each time she blooms, a facet of her god form comes into being as much as it does with her fight with us. I ultimately believe that her transformation during our battle is actually only the second bloom, rather than the final third bloom that most people seem to believe. I will explain this in depth and give you the answers you seek when we revisit Malenia in the Goddess of Rot chapter of this video. But more on that later. The Aeonian Swamp is a great example of what one would expect from the Age of Rot. The Aeonian bloom that bloomed during the battle between Malenia and Radahn has literally grown to wrap its tendrils through all of Caelid, spreading death and disease, but also new forms of life growing from that death. This is the vision of the world that the servants of Rot would have brought about, a world of constant death and rebirth. It is an ideal encapsulated well by the description of poison armament, and it reads as follows. Those who dwell within poison know Rot all too well, the death that begets life that comes to all equally. That is to say, it is the cycle of rebirth put into practice. Death begets life, and death comes to all equally. This is the promise and purpose of the Scarlet Rot. While Caelid to our eyes, and to the eyes of those who serve the Redmane, may look like a realm of utter hell and torment, one cannot deny that from the death is an abundance of new life that is growing. Yet the Scarlet Rot is not a natural phenomena. There is a hand behind the power of this rot, an outer god that once had a physical presence within these lands, inspiring the so-called Lords of Rot to champion its cause long ago, long before Malenia. So I would like to turn to the history of the Scarlet Rot that predates even Malenia's birth. The outer god of Rot is directly mentioned in the item of the Blue Dancer charm, and it reads as follows. The dancer in blue represents a fairy who in legend bestowed a flowing sword upon a blade swordsman. Blade in hand, the swordsman sealed away an ancient god, a god that was Rot itself. We will of course return to the blind swordsman later, but an important aspect to remember for now is the outer god of Rot is explicitly mentioned, so we know of their existence. as well as them being termed ancient. And again, I would suggest that most of the events we're going to talk about in this chapter happened a long time before the current events of the game. This outer god is also then mentioned in the Scorpion Stinger's item description, an item we know relates to this being due to its location deep within the Lake of Rot and surrounded by the Kindred of Rot. It is also a weapon that inflicts Scarlet Rot itself, and so with that association in mind, let's read the description. Dagger fashioned from a great scorpion's tail, glistening with scarlet rot, a ceremonial tool used by heretics, crafted from the relic of a sealed outer god. This stinger knife was fashioned from a large scorpion. Simultaneously, this is described as a relic of an outer god, implying that this great scorpion and the outer god are one and the same, that the outer god of Rot once had a physical form, or an aspect of him did have a physical form, that took the shape of a great scorpion, and given scorpions association with venom, as well as being heavily associated with death imagery, it makes sense that the outer god of Rot would have this as their physical form. But the physical presence of the scorpion stinger and the scorpion that it came from seems to go against what we see as normal for these outer gods. It has an implied physical form. If this relic is of the outer god, then it implies the stinger is made from the remains of a physical form, much as the bastard stars are crafted from the remains of Astel, and it is also termed a relic. This relic is now of course a holy medium for the pests who worship it, no doubt as an aspect of their ultimate creator, deep within the Grand Cloister. This is once again an ancient ruin built by the same people who built the Palace of Ul and Ald, something I talk about in detail on my Nox and Nocron video, and I would highly recommend you check that out if you want more information. But it is now being completely engulfed by the Lake of Rot, a pure Scarlet Rot lake that exists beneath the surface of the lands between. Malenia is responsible for the Scarlet Aeonia in Caelid, but the Lake of Rot seems to have zero ties with her, as it is nowhere near any of the sites where she has bloomed or visited, and it also seems far more advanced, as if it is a more advanced progression of Scarlet Rot, as if it has been around for a long time. What follows is my speculation, but I would suggest that the Lake of Rot is an earlier manifestation of the Scarlet Rot than the Swamp of Aeonia, no doubt gestated by the presence of this scorpion outer god itself, given we find the relic in the same area. And I also believe that due to another item we find in the area, a community or even a civilization propped up around the Lake of Rot, entranced by its power, and would serve as the first servants of Rot. For in this area we also find the mushroom crown item, and the description of the item reads as follows. Mushrooms found growing all over the body. These overgrown mushrooms form a towering headpiece. Long ago, great lords served the Scarlet Rot. Perhaps such fungal bodies served as their crowns. This, for me, is one of those item descriptions that just has massive implications for the game's lore as a whole. So it does say what I just suggested. There is a civilization of people who worshipped and served the Rot, and it happened long ago. These people had hierarchy and numbers enough to give rise to great lords, who wore these mushroom crowns as a symbol of their allegiance. One can't help but imagine what this community would have been like, people infected by the mushrooms, much like the servants of Rot we see today, led by these great lords of Rot, all in the presence of their scorpion god. Of course, as I mentioned in the prior chapter, this Rot Empire would probably not have had Kindred of Rot with them, as we see all the lore pointing to the fact that the Kindred of Rot would be born in the Caelid Swamp specifically, and be the children of Malenia specifically. Their presence here now can easily be explained away by the fact that they are intimately connected to the Rot, and so would of course be drawn here by the presence of the lake and the relic beyond. To me, the location of the mushroom crown, the scorpion stinger, and this massive body of Rot itself suggest to me that this was the centre of an old Rot kingdom and lords. When it comes to a timeline, I do see this as taking place quite a bit before the events of game, and before Malenia was probably born. In the Mushroom Crown, we see it's referred to as happening long ago, and secondly, the outer god of Rot is called Ancient. Indeed, reinforcing the idea that the Scarlet Rot predates Malenia's involvement is in the lore found in the item description of the Antspur Rapier, and it reads as follows. Scarlet Rot is an old legend, of which Marley Murray of the Shaded Castle was a private believer. It is an old legend. The events in Aeonia are far more recent, and to me it implies that the Scarlet Rot has long predated Malenia, and that this Lake of Rot and the Lords of Rot that came before are a long time past. So bringing this all together, deep underground we see that there was once a presence of the outer god of Rot physically manifested. From this would blossom what we now know as the Lake of Rot, and worshippers of this early Scarlet Rot would become great lords, leading the followers and faithful of the Scarlet Rot. And for these people it must have seemed as though the ascension of their order was inevitable, given the power of the Rot and the physical presence of this great scorpion. Alas, this was something that would soon be snatched away from them. Unfortunately for those of the Rot, agents of the flowing waters were moving against them. From the Scorpion Stinger item description, we learn that the outer god would become sealed, and we can learn more of this event if we reread the Blue Dancer charm, which again reads as follows. The dancer in blue represents a fairy, who in legend bestowed a flowing sword upon a blind swordsman. Blade in hand, the swordsman sealed away an ancient god, a god that was Rot itself. So let's unpack this one piece at a time. Firstly, we see it was the swordsman of the flowing blade who would defeat the outer god, sealing them away, which I take to mean that he removed the outer god's physical form, the scorpion one, from the mortal plane, leaving behind only the stinger relic. Significantly, the swordsman also seems to be the same warrior who would go on to be Malenia's mentor, as we learn from the prosthesis heirloom. But we will return to that subject in more detail later. However, we can see this warrior's technique in Malenia's own style, most clearly her waterfowl dance. What is interesting is that this dancer's technique, a flowing technique, seems to have some sort of power over the Rot, as well as a connection to flowing waters. We can learn more of this from the Blue Cloth set, the set for the warrior starting class, but it also seems to refer to the warrior of the flowing blade, due to the language used and the colour blue, and the description reads as follows. The blue colour of its fabric symbolises brisk waters, as fluid and flowing as the sword in hand of its wearer. Just as still waters turn foul, stagnation leads to decay. Warriors must remain ever drifting. So blue is representative of flowing waters, a colour used in reference to the fairy as we saw by the Blue Dancer charm, and the warrior of the flowing blade. Flowing sword movements are therefore evocative of fresh moving waters, in opposition to stagnant still water, and in turn decay. The idea of movement being related to purity and stillness being related to stagnation is nothing new in FromSoftware games, and the purity of water or the stagnation of it plays a massive role in Sekiro's storyline. This concept will also be grasped more quickly by those who are familiar with Japanese culture, but in short, in Shintoism, the ever-continuing cycle of life is represented as flowing water. Stagnation of water is seen as a corruption of this natural flow. This is a grossly oversimplified explanation, but you get the gist. So from this, we get the idea that flowing movements and blue, symbolising flowing water, is an important opposing force of the Scarlet Stagnant Rot, and it has some power over it. It now makes sense that this warrior was able to ward away and defeat the outer god of decay, of stagnation, by using the purifying techniques of his flowing blade. This clearly means that the fairy mentioned in the Blue Dancer charm, who gives this power to the blind swordsman, must also be connected to flowing water, and is in opposition to the power of decay and stagnation found in the Scarlet Rot. But who is this fairy? as they are never mentioned again in any other in-game lore. Well, thanks to a really perceptive Reddit user called Nameless Singer, we may well have an answer, and I would highly recommend you check out this thoughtful post, which I will link below. In this Reddit post on this very subject, they suggest that the fairy is none other than an embodiment of Shifra River itself. This already fits in with the flowing water themes we've picked up on, but more importantly, the reason they link this is because Shifra is Gaelic for fairy. Nameless Singer goes into further detail about how Ainsel could also be linked to fairies as well, giving this a full circle picture. So I would highly recommend you read that post in full, and again I commend Nameless Singer for making this important connection. This does tie up to me and makes perfect sense when I read it, because in various European folklore, especially in Celtic mythology, fairies are often seen as metaphysically tied to the water, sometimes the water folk. And so I do believe that it was Shifra River itself that gave the dancer his flowing techniques that drove away the outer god of Rot, the flowing natural water versus the stagnant decaying rot. With the outer god sealed and the rot forestalled for now, the blind swordsman would keep his vigilance until the rot would surface again, which it would, and this time in the form of Malenia. Thank you so much for watching this short Elden Ring lore video. This lore video is a segment from a much larger and longer video on my main channel, and a link to the full video can be found in the description. If you are interested in more Elden Ring lore content, then be sure to subscribe here and on my main channel Smotown. But until next time, I will see you in the lands between.